Last night, the government accepted recommendations from the UK's chief medical officers that children aged 12 to 15 should be offered a first dose of the coronavirus vaccine.
Well, the move means around 3 million children in England will now be eligible for the jab, which is expected to be administered in schools from as early as next week.
But as Vaccines Minister Nadhim Zahawi says, children will get the final say over whether or not they get the vaccine. We are joined now by Dr. Philippa and Dr. Renee Hoenderkamp to share their views on the subject. Welcome both of you.
Good morning.
Renee, let's start with you here. So the announcement comes after the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, said it did not recommend vaccinating well children aged 12 to 15 on health grounds alone. Yesterday, the Vaccine Minister Nadhim Zahawi said it was never within the JCVI's remit to consider the wider impacts of vaccination, such as the benefits for children in education or the mental health benefits that come with knowing that you are protected. So those are the two sides here. We've got the two sides, obviously, with you guys today. Your thoughts? You are opposed.
I am opposed. Good morning, guys. So I'm opposed to actually doing anything to a child that might cause them harm, but doesn't bring with it any tangible benefits. Now, to actually put that into perspective, sadly, 1 to 2 children per million will die of COVID. So it's almost zero. It's tiny in terms of, statistics. However, we have seen data from Israel and the USA, where anywhere between 1 in 3,000 and 1 in 10,000 children will get myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. Now, the JCVI were worried about this, and they actually said that there are considerable unknown risks about the future of having had myocarditis and what damage that may do to the heart. And we can't possibly know because we haven't had enough time to see. And there might be damage to the heart that we don't find for a year or 2 years or even 5 years. There has been a child in America that is currently being investigated by CDC, a 13-year-old who died in his sleep after his second Pfizer dose. So there are risks of children dying, there are risks of children getting myocarditis, and almost no benefit in terms of the long-term outcomes. Not one person under 20 has died in the UK from January to August this year from COVID. This virus does very little harm. More people, more children under the age of 14 die from chickenpox, and parents don't lock their children away or give them vaccines, although they can give a chickenpox vaccine, but it's not part of the UK.
Well, let's ask Dr. Philippa now, because obviously, I've got a 12-year-old son, so hearing some of those things, it does make you think a little bit there. But give the other side of this, because, what she's saying there is incredibly rare. Yes, we've heard about this, might have an impact on the heart, but over here, the vaccine will be slightly different because it'll only be one jab. So just sort of alleviate any concerns.
So the JCVI obviously looked at the vaccine and the virus, and the CMOs then looked much more holistically at education and at mental health. Now, the JCVI figures are different to the figures that Dr. Renee has just said, and they have said that per million children who are vaccinated, we would save 87 hospital admissions, 15 cases of PIMS, which is that paediatric inflammatory syndrome, to about 2.5 admissions to the PICU, which is the paediatric intensive care. And that is balanced against somewhere between 3 and 17, about 13, they think, cases of myocarditis, which is generally mild. Now, Dr. Renee also mentioned about the long-term unknowns. Yes, there are long-term unknowns. There are also long-term unknowns about the impact of long COVID, about the impact of myocarditis from getting COVID. And there are some known long-term things. For example, we know that the biggest drivers of physical and mental health globally are actually access to education. And so we know from lots of data over the years that disrupting that has a huge effect on children. And so on the balance of those things, one would say to vaccinate, and that's what Chris Whitty and the other CMOs said.
Philippa, a lot of this, the JCVI, that's the scientists. We've been told all the way through here, we've got to follow the science. And we're all for the government's following the science. But this is policy now. This is not science. This is political, and so that's a sea change.
I don't think that's quite Correct, actually, because we need to think about the separate sort of entities here. There's the MHRA, who are the Medicines Regulation Agency, and they decide whether or not a vaccine is safe and to give a license. And they've given a license to the COVID vaccine for children over the age of 12, and they're following other countries like America and the rest of the EU. Then there is the JCVI, who are an independent body, but talking about deploying this in general. And then there are the CMOs, and they're looking more generally at the other impacts, not just of the vaccine alone and of the virus alone.
Philippa, you've got to admit, when you say all of that and all of those letters and all of those people, it's really confusing.
It is really confusing, but I do think at some point you have to decide where are we going to get our information from and who we're going to trust. And the CMOs, they consulted with the Royal College of Paediatricians, the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, various public health agencies, various experts in modelling and data. And I think that they've gone and they've got the expert opinion from people that are very highly regarded in their fields. And at some point, I think as a parent, we have to say, well, they've gone and got their information from these marvellous sources, and that's what we have to go for. And it's so important that whilst parents and children are going to be making their decisions about this, that they are getting their information from reputable sources.
Renee, can I ask you, because one of the minister said the driving force behind this is, of course, education, but how will having the vaccine benefit the situation we're in now? Because at the moment, things have changed, the isolation rules have changed. We're not seeing whole classes being taken out of the education system for one case of COVID. So how is this going to make it better? Is it a transmission thing? Because we're being told that actually it doesn't stop transmission.
OK, I think that's a really valid point, Holly, because what we have to remember is the reason that children have missed education is actually not because of COVID, it's because of COVID policy. If you look around Europe, as Philippa says, people have done things differently. Finland, for example, did not send any children home from school. We have actually lost 44% of our school time, which is the highest in Europe apart from Italy. So that's a choice that we made. We've been testing healthy children and sending them home. We didn't have to do that. Now, if you look at the vaccine, everybody at home who's vulnerable is vaccinated if they want to be. Every teacher is vaccinated if they want to be. And we now know, there was a big Oxford study last week which shows that the viral load in the noses of vaccinated people who can still catch COVID, although I think in lower amounts, but they still can, the viral load is the same and they can still transmit it as much as an unvaccinated person. So using the argument that stopping transmission by vaccinating children will help actually doesn't hold up anymore, because these vaccines don't stop people catching it and they don't stop people transmitting it. They do stop people dying who are vulnerable, and that's fantastic. That's what we want. We don't want people dying of this disease. But at the same time, why are we vaccinating children when we can't see a transmission benefit and there are some harms and they don't need it?
Parents are going to be asked to give consent for the jab. So if a child or a parent have opposing views and the child is considered competent to decide, the child will have the final say. That opens up a whole great can of worms. The parents say no, the child says yes. You have a class full of most children who mostly want to have it, but the child decides they don't want to, so then you've got peer pressure. How on earth is that going to work?
So I don't think that that's actually anything that we should do. I don't think we should go down that route. Never before have we given a child the actual benefit of saying, I'm going to overrule my parent on a vaccine. It doesn't happen in the UK. It hasn't happened. 12-year-olds really, as you know, as eloquent and as intelligent, as fantastic as they are, really can't properly comprehend these risks, I don't believe. As a GP, I have used Gillick competence once in the last 11 years when a child was going to be at harm if I did not treat them. And that's not the case with this vaccine. Not giving the vaccine doesn't leave the child at harm. And let's not forget, When a child becomes a teenager, they almost become anti-parent. That's in the rule book. So they could well want to go against their parents. And we also know that once teenagers step out of the house, their peer pressure actually has more influence on their decision making than parents. So we are actually handing things over to children who actually don't always have their best interests at heart, and they don't even know it. If they wanted to drive a car at 12 because they felt it was good for them, we wouldn't let them because it would be dangerous. We wouldn't let them take 12 paracetamols in an hour because that would be dangerous. Where does this stop?
OK,
Philippa?
let's get a final word from you, Philippa.
So when we're talking about competence, we're talking about intelligence and maturity and the ability to understand the risks and the benefits. Now, was clear that they are going to ask for written parental consent, as they do for other boosters. But this is something which is set in law, these competencies that say that for children who are between 12 and 15, that if they have the capacity, that they can make that decision. And we do often make those decisions, for example, for a 15-and-a-half-year-old who wants to go on the contraceptive pill. So these are decisions that are made. I would really encourage every parent to be talking to their child. We definitely have children that will go against the peer pressure and have a vaccine or not have a vaccine. And the other thing which is really clear and was written very strongly in the letter from the CMOs is that we have to be respectful of everybody's decision, whether they have the vaccine or not, and not stigmatise anybody for the decisions that they make.